For this deep dive, we're picking up on a discussion that's, well, top of mind for Canadians. Where do things stand with the impacts of the Canadian boycott against the U.S.? And is it setting an example for other countries? We're digging into it here to understand what's happening right now using the latest reports. Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today really is to track the real-time fallout and, the projected consequences of this whole thing, especially looking at the next 3 years of the current U.S. presidential mandate. This has gone way beyond just consumer choice, hasn't it? It feels like high-stakes global politics now.
It absolutely is. And it's vital, I think, for you, the listener, to frame this correctly. The Canada-U.S. relationship isn't just close. It's deeply interdependent. Historically, like 75% of our imports come from the U.S. That's, about $450 billion USD a year. So this boycott, driven by citizens, but let's be honest, tacitly supported in some areas, it's less an economic tool and more a complex political lever. It's designed to force policy change, maybe, but also to fundamentally redefine that entire relationship.
And going by the scorecard we've pieced together, that lever is definitely causing some pain on both sides. Let's look at the immediate financial hit as of, say, early November 2025. This isn't symbolic. We're seeing estimates suggesting the U.S. economy has already lost over $20 billion just in 2025 from lower Canadian spending.
20 billion U.S. That's a huge number, absolutely. But Canada's paying a pretty steep price, too, for this political stand. Because of the U.S. reprisals, the new tariffs they slapped on back in February, the direct cost to the Canadian economy is shaping up to be around 12 billion Canadian dollars per year.
Wait, hang on. 12 billion CAD a year?
Yeah.
Just from U.S. tariffs?
Yeah.
That's intense. It shows how fast the U.S. reacted. Is it seen as worth it for the long-term goal of, say, structural independence?
Well, that's the core tension, isn't it? The immediate pain versus the long-term political aim. And to really get that cost, we need to see where the damage is actually concentrated. Which sectors are feeling it most?
Okay, yeah, let's break that down, because some industries must be absolutely reeling. Tourism comes to mind immediately. Huge cross-border flow, usually.
Took a massive hit. U.S. tourism losses are projected around $2.1 billion US dollars for this year alone. Just think, in 2024, Canadians made, 20.4 million visits south? Now projections are showing a drop of maybe 40% to 40% for 2025.
Wow.
But here's the interesting flip side. That lost travel money. Some of it seems to be fueling Canadian local tourism. A small domestic silver lining, maybe.
A temporary silver lining, perhaps. But surely that's outweighed by hits to manufacturing, especially in those really integrated sectors, like autos.
Precisely. Yeah. The auto industry, its supply chains are so deeply woven across the border. It's a major, major pain point. We're seeing sharp drops, like 30%, 50% declines for certain American car brands here in Canada.
And it ripples globally, too, right? I saw a note about Tesla sales in Europe.
Yeah, that's a key indicator. Sources mention a 50% drop for Tesla in Europe. It shows this kind of consumer action. It can spread.
Which really underscores the fragility you mentioned, those integrated supply chains. It goes way beyond the finished car on the lot. It hits parts, components, agro-food, even clean tech. These aren't simple fixes, and it means job pressures. Both sides of the border.
Absolute critical point. It disrupts the middle of the economy, the inputs, the components. So yeah, employment pressure isn't just about sales figures. It's hitting production, logistics, major industrial areas across North America.
Okay, so let's look beyond the immediate damage then. The 20 billion U.S. loss, the 12 billion Canadian cost. Let's talk the long view. What happens if this boycott keeps going, say, for the next 3 years for the rest of the current U.S. mandate?
Yeah.
What does that sustained contraction look like?
The sustained pressure scenario is significant. For the U.S., you could be looking at potential losses climbing to anywhere between, say, $60 billion and maybe even $100 billion total over that period.
$100 billion.
Potentially. And that scale translates directly into job losses, especially in U.S. states heavily relying on exporting goods to Canada.
And for Canada, we might be hitting political targets, but the economic drag continues.
Oh, yes. Canadian GDP growth would definitely slow down. We're talking an estimated loss of maybe 10 to 15 billion Canadian dollars annually. That impact hits manufacturing and autos hardest, obviously, as they scramble for parts. And for consumers, the pinch comes from persistent inflation.
Why inflation specifically?
Well, because while we're trying to find alternatives to U.S. fruits, vegetables, parts, getting those things from Europe or Asia just costs more logistically. Shipping isn't cheap. Over those 3 years, unemployment could tick up by, say, 1 to 1.5 percentage points.
That sounds like a really painful adjustment period. Necessary, maybe, from a policy standpoint, but painful. Canada historically got 75% of its imports from the U.S. Now we're forced to rapidly diversify. So what does that transformation, let's call it scenario 2, actually look like? Finding new partners.
Scenario 2 is basically hitting fast forward on global pivots. Canada's actively, rapidly looking towards Europe, Asia, maybe other partners like India. The big trade-off is operational. Sure, diversifying makes Canada less vulnerable long-term to sudden U.S. policy shifts, but these alternatives mean higher logistics costs, pure distance. It's expensive, frankly, to redraw 75% of your supply map on the fly.
Right, so we trade geographic convenience for political stability, even if shipping costs go up. But surely this must also be boosting domestic production. A buy Canadian effect.
It is. That's scenario 3, what you could call economic nationalism kicking in. This kind of structural shock does stimulate more domestic production, more local consumption. There's definitely a psychological element to the boycott that encourages people to, buy Canadian. That's where the change starts to feel maybe a bit more positive locally.
But any big pivot like this carries huge risks, right?
Right.
We must be talking massive government intervention to smooth things over.
Exactly. To cushion the blow, supporting jobs, maybe subsidizing local production, funding new logistics, the government is stepping up support. But that risks blowing up the public deficit.
Yeah.
And another key risk, it worsens social disparities.
How so?
Well, regions that are heavily dependent on cross-border trade, think parts of Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, they face much more immediate economic hardship than regions less tied to the U.S. The pain isn't spread evenly at all.
Okay, so if the short and medium term are so costly, we have to focus on the long game. Scenario 4, geopolitical redefinition. This isn't just about trade stats anymore. It's about Canada being forced to fundamentally rethink its global position.
And this is arguably where the political value of the boycott starts to materialize, despite the economic pain. The pressure forces, or at least accelerates, Canada's push to strengthen alliances elsewhere, Europe, Japan, India. This focus on integrating into new trade deals, it ultimately reduces our vulnerability to U.S. policy swings. It's proactively trying to shape a new global commercial hierarchy, one less centered on North America.
So in that light, the Canadian movement is kind of a political catalyst, which brings us to the global ripple effect, this idea that our boycott isn't just happening here, it's maybe inspiring other economies to push back against U.S. protectionism. It's being seen as a model, a statement.
The clearest evidence of that contagion effect is definitely in Europe, especially the Nordic countries. They're really showing how coordinated citizen action can have teeth. Look at Denmark. You've got social media groups coordinating the boycott with 60,000 members. Retailers are even starting to separate U.S. products on shelves.
And it's going beyond just groceries or clothes.
Right.
Into industry.
Yeah. In Norway, there are reports of companies like Haltback Bunkers refusing to refuel U.S. ships. That's a very specific, very targeted industrial action. And look at the sales figures again. Sweden saw Tesla sales drop 44%.
In Germany.
Yeah.
That figure was just staggering, a 76% drop in Tesla sales year over year.
76%, yeah. That kind of number tells you something about the emotional and political buy-in from consumers over there.
So it's not just Europe.
No, the movement has resonance elsewhere. Asian countries, China, Japan, South Korea, they've also brought in countermeasures against U.S. tariffs, and they're explicitly linking their actions in part to the Canadian situation. They see it as part of a broader strategy against protectionism. The world is definitely watching to see how effective this kind of coordinated pressure can be.
But it still seems like Canada is the place where it hits hardest because of our deep integration with the U.S.
That's the key nuance, exactly. The boycott works best, or at least has the most immediate economic impact. Here, because our economies are so intertwined, consumer choices in Canada translate almost directly into pain for specific U.S. exporters. Elsewhere, it's still largely a citizen-led movement focused on certain sectors, food, cars, maybe energy. The overall impact is, for now, limited by lower levels of pre-existing interdependence compared to the Canada-U.S. link.
Okay, so if we pull all this together, the core tension is pretty clear, isn't it? The boycott is arguably politically effective, makes the U.S. pay attention, forces a reaction, but it comes with really painful short-term economic costs, both for us and for them. Crucially, though, for Canada, this whole painful episode is basically accelerating a long-term, maybe necessary, redefinition of our supply chains and our place in the world.
It's speeding up structural changes that might have taken decades otherwise, which I think raises a really interesting question for you, the listener, to think about as you watch this play out globally. If this kind of political pressure, the citizen-led economic pressure, actually succeeds in forcing significant global commercial diversification away from relying too heavily on any single country, will consumer boycotts, once seen as sort of a fringe tool, become a permanent, maybe even accepted part of international diplomatic strategy in the future?
That is definitely something to chew on as these global dynamics keep shifting. This has been a deep dive from the podcast to Philippe. If you found this valuable, please do help us reach 2,000 subscribers and share our podcast. Thanks for joining the conversation today.